Gonna let them in. And we are going to go ahead and get started. I am so thankful to be here today. This is going to be a great session. Thank you for you guys who are joining us. This will be shared on recording as well for those that couldn't make it live. But this is going to be so, well, fun is not the right word because grief is hard. But I love at Inheritance of Hope how we walk alongside each other through hard things, through difficult things. And so the fact that you're joining this session likely means that you've been impacted by grief, either personally or through someone you love. And certainly all of us walk alongside lots of people through our relationships in life where we want to be a support and we want to learn tools as well to be able to walk through these difficult things with a few more resources at our fingertips. So, excuse me, we are going to take a few minutes and spend some time talking about anticipatory grief. And I'm so excited for the people that are on this panel to be able to introduce you to some very special people. All three of these people are very special to me. One of them you can't see right now, so you're probably wondering, what is she talking about? But we are very blessed to have Erica Sarine. She is joining us virtually. She had to pre-record her segment for this, but we're going to be interjecting her professional knowledge into this entire session. She is a licensed counselor. She is a employer at St. Jude's Children's Hospital right now. She works with kids. She is also a very gifted teacher, and she has presented at many different events. Gina and I were fortunate and blessed to present with her this past year at a big event. She is an expert on anticipatory grief. She wrote her doctorate thesis on it, and she has so many nuggets of wisdom to share with us. And so that is why we have pre-recorded her segment to be able to share that with you guys. So we're going to use her interspersed throughout this presentation, this session. So Erica Sarine, welcome her. I'm also excited to introduce you to Gina Rose. She is a licensed counselor, also very, very informed on grief and trauma, and she's walked through a lot of hard things with a lot of people, and she is a wealth of knowledge. She has created some amazing resources with Inheritance of Hope that helps families through anticipatory grief. And so she's going to get to speak into a lot of that today, and we're very blessed to have her. And then we also have my great friend, Erin Thomas. We happen to grow up together, but the way that she's here today is because we served her family last year on a Hope at Home weekend. And she's going to share a little bit more about her story with you, but she personally walked this journey through anticipatory grief and passing of her husband and then post-loss grief. So she has a very personal perspective on some of these topics that we're going to talk about today. So welcome, Erica, Gina, Erin, and welcome to all of you that are joining us. Even some are still popping in now. I see some familiar names and just so glad to have you guys. And I hope that this time is very helpful to you and that you leave here with many helpful resources. And most importantly, that you know you're not alone, because at Inheritance of Hope, we want to walk alongside you in your grief. And so without further ado, we are going to actually kick off this session with a little bit of background. When you came to this session, you maybe thought, what is anticipatory grief? I'm not exactly sure. And Erica, as the expert that I just introduced her as, is going to start us off by telling us, what is anticipatory grief? What does that even mean? And so I'm going to share this quick, it's about 7-minute video of Erica Sarine teaching us a little bit about what anticipatory grief is. So if your view setting is a little bit skewed, please feel free to play with the settings so that you can see and hear Erica in the best possible way. So here we go. Take it away, Erica.
Hey everybody, I am so honored to be here, even if virtually, for this workshop today. And I thank you all so much for attending. Thank you also for extending me grace, as this is pre-recorded and it most likely won't be the same as it would be if I were there. But I am grateful to my colleagues from Inheritance of Hope who are able to be there today to assist with this presentation. And so, I think this topic of grief and loss is so relevant to all of us. And so anticipatory grief, initially described by Dr. Eric Lindemann, a psychiatrist, in an article he wrote, was really referring to a soldier who returned home following deployment and found that his wife had sort of emotionally and completely detached from him because she was preparing herself for his death. She did not expect him to come home. She didn't think he was going to come home. And so she psychologically detached. And so what he talked about was that because that spouse was anticipating, the death of her spouse, that described this feeling of anticipatory grief. Now, we know later, and we're going to talk about it in just a minute, that Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work in 1969, her book on death and dying, was really a pioneering work where she referred to similar concept, and she referred to it as preparatory grief. So today, what we're going to talk about is anticipatory grief of the patient or the person who might be dying, of their family members and their friends. And so we know, right, that family members are often forced to manage the different emotions and the expectations that are associated with the fear of losing their loved one when someone they know is dying. And that is today what we refer to as anticipatory grief. That's how it's conceptualized today. It's when we're managing those emotions, those expectations, and those experiences associated with the worry and the fear and the anxiety of losing someone we deeply love. So let's talk about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work. You might have been familiar with her book on death and dying, like I mentioned before, that she published in 1969. She also wrote a really great article in 1971 in the American Journal of Nursing. And in that article, she said what it is like to be dying. And she wrote about these qualitative interviews that she had attained with 400 people who were dying. So let's talk about that just for a minute, right? So qualitative researchers interview, right? They get data in the form of words and they conduct a lot of different interviews. In this case, this is what her qualitative research was. They transcribed those interviews and then she looked for themes. Were there any themes that emerged through the data? She never intended for her work to be a staged, sequenced work. That's how we have interpreted her work. So she came up with these themes that we're all pretty familiar with now. In medical school, they teach it as DABDA, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. You've probably heard of it. So let's unpack that. First, I want to say this. Again, it was never intended to be a linear sequence to describe post-death grief. Isn't that interesting? Because that today is how most people associate her work. They'll say, oh, the stages of grief. But in actuality, these were the stages or the phases or really the common themes associated with anticipatory grief, with the feeling that dying people themselves had. And so let's talk about what she said in her 1971 article. The first theme that she identified was denial. And in denial, she said that was sort of like a no, not me, is how she described it in her article, that this can't be true. And a lot of times people equate denial with a bad thing, but in actuality, right, it's a defense mechanism. It's a self-protection that we have. It helps us seek second opinions. It saves lives sometimes. And what Dr. Kubler-Ross found was out of the 400 patients that she initially interviewed, only 3 of them maintained this feeling of denial until their death. And so again, this was something that a lot of people did feel upon diagnosis. Then she talked about anger, which she called anger sort of the why me. And she said that anger was sometimes directed at healthcare professionals or higher power, God, for example, or sometimes sometimes, and my friends at hospice or palliative care services will know this, sometimes the anger is directed at anyone who represents life and who represents health. She also found that some clients bargained, right? And this was the yes, me, but, and that most of that bargaining, by the way, was done with God or a higher power. If you'll give me more time, then I'll do this. But interestingly, sometimes that bargaining, and we'll learn just a little bit, changes shape. And it might change shape in terms of if I can see one more sunrise, right? Or if I can make it to this trip to Walt Disney World that I had planned with my family. So it can change shape for people. She found too that depression was a common theme. And I want to read a direct quote from her 1971 article and how she talked about depression. Because again, I think sometimes when we know people or love people who have received a diagnosis or a prognosis that is very poor, we might equate that depression as something, oh, we don't want them to be depressed or they shouldn't be depressed. But here's what she said about it in 1971. She said, if I were to lose one beloved person, everybody would allow, even expect me to grieve. It would be perfectly normal because I would have lost one person I loved. But the dying patient is about to lose not just one beloved person, but everyone he has ever loved and everything that has been meaningful to him. That is 1,000 times sadder. She goes on to say, if the patient has the courage to face this, then he should be allowed to grieve. He has a right to it. We call this preparatory grief. That's how this term came to be. Right? It was as she was writing about these symptoms or reactions of depression that were common in people who were facing the end of their own lives and who were facing the end of saying goodbye to everybody and everything they had ever loved. And then last, she talks about acceptance. And in her article, she says, acceptance is not resignation or giving up. It was really what she described, and this is a quote from her, it's, I have said all I need to say, and I am ready to go. What we want to do here in this workshop is to help you, help people and their families say what they need to say and do what they need to do so that they can feel a peace when they are ready to let go. Let's discuss the emotions related to anticipatory grief. Do you notice?
So, Erin, if you could turn your video back on and join us.
Hey, it said the host has stopped the video, so it won't let me do it.
I will gladly help you out.
Okay.
There you go.
There we go. Sorry.
You're good. So let's talk a little bit about that. Gina,
Yep.
Tell us a little bit about your experience in your profession about this whole stages of grief business.
Yeah, I've done counseling for about 25 years now and worked with a lot of people who are grieving. And it's interesting to me how we usually, like Erica was saying, we usually associate this with post-grief, these stages of grief. And people ask me, like, what stage do you think I'm in? And I also remember just in my own grief journeys, like over time, like different people that I've lost in my life, kind of trying to figure out, where am I? Like, I don't feel like I'm bargaining. Am I supposed to be bargaining? Like, am I missing something here? But I love that this is really about the anticipatory grief part, and just walking through this with people through IOH. These are themes that definitely come up. This really is the experience that people are living in. That denial sense of that initial, like, no, not me, as Erica was saying, that anger phase or that theme of anger there, where we go through times where we're like, why me? Like, why is this happening to me? The bargaining, yes, me, but maybe God, if I could just, the depression for sure. And getting to a place of acceptance, saying, I think, I've done what I need to do. I've said what I need to say, and I'm ready. That's definitely part of the experiential part of anticipatory grief that I see all the time. with our friends through IOH. And I'm grateful for that distinction, because I think that's really important. 'Cause it's just different than what people think,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah, and I know Aaron, I know Jeremy has passed away, but there was a long period of time that he was sick, and you guys had this prognosis, you and your two sons and Jeremy, kind of looming, that doctors had told you a certain expectation, and certainly we know sometimes doctors are wrong. But in your case, as you were kind of living that out, how did this anticipatory grief idea and these themes of grief kind of resonate in your personal experience?
I would say that when you have 14 months, we had 14 months from diagnosis to death, and you do go through all those stages, but all a different timing. And I have two boys, teenage boys, and they went through different seasons when we were going through different seasons. And I really loved what Emily, is her name?
Erica.
Erica, thank you. It's an E name. What she said about, you know, the family, but then the actual patient. I watched Jeremy kind of go through that, start out in fear, and then, you know, he had a gift of time. He had 14 months to really process and say a lot of things. And we got to see all of it, but I watched him go from fear to hope, which was nice. But yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if anybody in the chat, I mean, certainly feel free to engage there. We're reading it and we'd love to kind of hear as you guys are processing. I don't know where all of you are at. I recognize some of the names, and I know that some of you are in the part of the journey where you're the diagnosed parent and or the caregiver, but you're still actively fighting an illness and dealing with this prognosis that's kind of always there, looming. You're still fighting and praying for a cure and hoping, and that's what we're doing with you. But I know you probably have some things to add as Erin shares her personal story. Feel free to use the chat and be a part of this, this discussion. Erin, I'm curious if there was anything in your experience that helped both you and your husband and the rest of your family, your boys, to come to a place of acceptance as you kind of walked this journey and being ready, feeling like you were ready to let go.
I would say that my faith is definitely how we walked through the process, and we did wrestle with our faith like everyone would. My husband died at 44. That's just not really what you think is supposed to happen. So after you wrestle with the actual facts of this is what's happening, it kind of turned into a beautiful thing because we got to have so much time to have all those conversations and to be transparent with our kids. Are you really who you say you are, what you really believe? I mean, it's really easy to say that I'm hopeful and I have joy in all circumstances, until you really have to choose that in those circumstances. And I can honestly say it with a pure heart that it was a great joy to watch Jeremy walk through that, because his whole theme was, I'm going to choose joy. And he did. At first, you know, like I said, he was angry, but then he's like, no, I've been given this runway. I need to, and I think Matthew Sweat talked about it last night, like a runway of, what am I going to do with this time, and how am I going to bless others and bless, you know, my family? And I could write a book on all the stories and the impact that his choosing joy through those 14 months, and honestly, that's still happening today. I get stories quite a bit of how his life and how he chose to fight and actually be at peace with diagnosis and his journey, how it's impacted others and encouraged others to find their faith and love their children, love their wives, their families, reconcile. There's all kinds of things, but I will tell you, he did something very well, is that we talked about everything. And that is a gift of inheritance of hope, truly, because I don't have anything that I don't have answers for that he would have wanted or anything like that. So.
Thanks for sharing that. I'm wondering, as Erica was talking about the stages of grief and how I know some some out there, a lot of us think about it as terms of post-loss grief. And so now you're exactly a year after Jeremy passed away a year ago last week or the week before. You've now experienced anticipatory grief and post-loss grief. And I'm curious from your perspective, because I'm sure some of the people that are on this session, how is that the same and different? Like, did you experience all those themes in both? I'm guessing maybe so, but how has that played out for you and your boys?
I think it's really difficult to, I don't know. Like I said, I had the 14 months, so there are a lot of people that don't get that. You know, there's tragic deaths and you don't get to have all those things, but we got to take some beautiful trips. We got to make memories. Jeremy was a huge memory maker. He didn't care about stuff. And so I got to see him live that out. We went to Montana. He skied in Aspen with one eye and half of his body not working. He skied down some really nice slopes that he was 6'3", 240 football player. So he's not a small man to fall. And he would trust us. My sons would go before him and I would be behind him just to make sure he got down the mountain. And so that process of making those memories was such a gift. And then on the other side, on the flip side, when I'm choosing to make deposits or, plans for trips, there is zero guilt for me doing that because Jeremy gave me that love for memories that we can do that. And my children actually find peace and connection with their father by continuing to do the things that we love, i.e. football games, baseball, skiing. And I think that's how we transition from that pre and anticipatory grief to now it's real. Like he is not here. There's a big hole in our house, but we talk about him and our memories. And I mean, it's such a gift that we could do that on both sides, like pre-diagnosis, diagnosis, death, and then post-death. And, my kids I have a senior and a junior. They're looking at colleges, and we just went and looked at where he played college football, and we weren't crying. We were happy, and we felt him with us. And I think that's from partially starting the grieving before he passed and then honoring him with our making of memories.
That is so good. Yeah, I love that.
That's good.
Well, I'm excited to dive into this other segment of Erica's video. It's another short clip, and she's going to walk us through a little bit of some of the emotions of grief. So I'm going to share my screen again and let you experience this one.
Let's discuss the emotions related to anticipatory grief. Do you notice on this slide that I have the word motion underlined and emotion? That's because our grief emotions require movement. They require motion. I sometimes tell people that feelings have one goal in life: to be felt, right? We need to feel. And so the literature right now supports that there is consistent overlap between symptoms of anticipatory grief and symptoms of what we often refer to as conventional grief, which really would be what we know most as post-loss grief, right? So again, the literature does support that a lot of the things that people feel after a death, they may, as they're preparing for a loved one to die, they may feel some of those things in preparation or ahead of the death. In fact, there was an article published in 2020 by Coelho and colleagues. And what these researchers did is they conducted qualitative interviews. Dr. Kubler-Ross did qualitative research too. So they interviewed 26 family caregivers, and they wanted to discuss the anticipatory grief experience for them. Now, again, this is evidence from 26 people, right? But what they found is a few elements. They found first that some people experience traumatic distress from being exposed to these life-threatening conditions, things like the uncertainty of the illness or worrying that they might not be able to provide the care that their loved one needs. Having some of this, what they referred to actually as vicarious suffering, right? Because their loved one is suffering and now they're feeling that suffering as well. And just by the fact that their lives were completely disrupted. So they found that we do need to be aware that some people have these feelings of traumatic distress. They also found that some people have separation distress just by anticipating the loss. Some of that separation distress was just caused by the current relational losses, because things change in a relationship. Think about a marriage. When one partner is ill, things change there, right? Our relationship changes, the way that we relate to one another. Sometimes we might have feelings of separation anxiety, of not wanting to be alone or not wanting to be away from our loved ones. And so these were some of the things that fell into that separation distress category. And then they also said a third theme or category that emerged from their interviews with caregivers who were experiencing anticipatory grief was this just trouble with either emotional regulation and dysregulation. So they said sometimes caregivers thought that they might have to conceal their emotions because they wanted to protect their loved one who was dying from feeling some of that emotional pain. And others said they were having such intense symptoms and grief reactions that they almost felt the physical symptoms of their grief, a panic or anxiety or appetite changes, all of these things that we're going to talk about on the next slide. So again, those three categories that they identified, I think just help us frame that this is a really difficult experience for caregivers, and it is something that we want to support. Also, when we learn about these self-regulation efforts, right, where these caregivers are feeling a need to conceal their emotions or maybe hide their emotions from their loved ones, we know that sometimes we can create these legacy building activities and some open dialogue and open discussion with families that can help facilitate that process for them when they're feeling worried about it. So we want to be able to come alongside caregivers and families and support them through their loved one's illness and really help maybe develop some protective factors there for them as well. All right, so now let's talk about some of these emotions that I alluded to on the prior slide. First, as I mentioned, there is consistent overlap between post-loss or conventional loss emotions and then some of these more anticipatory grief-related emotions. We know there's overlap there. And so here you see some of these on the slide. Some of these are very primal, defensive, survival-oriented behaviors. A loss or an illness is a threat to our system and to our survival. And so our bodies and our emotions are going to respond in a protest-oriented or survival-oriented way to keep us safe. And so some of these things that you'll see, like shock or disbelief or anger, these are going to be some of those instinctual behaviors. Also, if you notice on this slide, these emotions are very, or grief reactions, if you will, are emotional, spiritual, physical, and relational. And so this illustrates that grief, even anticipatory grief, impacts the entire family and it impacts the entire person. Keep in mind that with these, they impact people in different ways. So the way a child might experience anticipatory grief is very different from the way that an adult might experience anticipatory grief, and two adults in the same family might have very different reactions of grief.
Okay, Gina is going to walk us through some handouts that we use at Inheritance of Hope that really help to share some of these emotions and help us communicate.
All right.
As families. So I'm going to pass this to Gina and share this first handout.
Yeah, I think what I love about what Eric is saying, for sure, feelings have one goal, right? And that is to be felt and lived out. And so when we're going through this, especially in the context of families, being able to communicate what we're feeling is super helpful in the journey. It becomes like really important in order for everybody to navigate together and stay together through that time. And this is one activity that we use that if you've attended one of our events, you've probably been familiar with, but we call it Color Your Heart. And it's a way for family members to express. In fact, we recommend doing this all the time, like as often as you feel like it, like, okay, it's time to do a color your heart. Like, let's kind of check in and see where everybody is today. And it becomes a snapshot of what we're experiencing. So you pick 5 or 6 feelings that are going on, because we feel lots of things at the same time. And you pick a color for each of those feelings, and you fill in the heart to equal the amount of each feeling. So if you have a lot of one, then it takes up a lot of the heart. And this becomes a really helpful thing, a really easy way to discuss what you're feeling with the people in your family. And we highly recommend this particular exercise for that. And I'm sure Erin's going to have some comments about this too in a minute, but yeah, this is one of my favorites. Another handout that we like to offer families has to do with how to help your kids through anticipatory grief. And here it comes, there it comes. So there we go. Helping your kids, this is a way to help talk with your kids. It's also a way for you to be aware of what their experience is. Kind of, we always say at Inheritance of Hope that you are the expert on your own children. And so we want to give you some tools to address them, but we know that you have the most wisdom in how they're wired specifically. But this is a handout that we offer. I don't necessarily need to go through the whole thing, but just some highlight things. Like we want to help kids feel safe through anticipatory grief. So we want to exercise patience when they express a whole spectrum of emotions, because they will. And one of the parts of grief that's tricky too is that we can feel like 20 things at the same time. We think we only feel one thing at a time, but really we have a lot of things going on at once. We want kids to feel heard. And so there's some specific ways that we try to help parents be able to really listen to their kids. We want kids to feel understood. So not just heard, but also like, I really get where you're coming from. We kind of want to recognize when kids need more help, because sometimes they do. Sometimes they need a little extra support. We want to know how kids react, like what are some normal reactions to grief and what may be coloring outside the lines, which is really what the kids need more help. And then how do kids heal as well? What are things that help them through the process, keeping them healthy through it? And so these are handouts that are, I think they're on the app, right?
Yeah, I was just actually going to say that for some of you who are like, oh, I need to take a screenshot really quick of my computer, I just want to point you to the Hope at Home app. It is something that we shared in all the sessions, but if you don't already have it, you can go to Google Play or App Store, type in Hope at Home. It's kind of a navy blue square. It has the words Hope at Home in white. And if you go into the icon that says Legacy Folder, down there at the bottom, these 3 handouts, the one that Gina just shared with Color My Heart, this one here about helping your kids through anticipatory grief, and then this next one that Gina's going to go through in a second. Are you done with this one, Gina? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
If you guys just go to the Hope at Home app and scroll down to that, they're all 3 listed there. And we would love for you to use those with your kids and like share them with people in your lives that could benefit from it. Gina did not make those to keep safe within IOH. We want people to use those and benefit from them. So please feel free to check those out. And this last one, Gina, you're going to touch on the tips for talking to your kids, or just mention it? Do you want me to?
I'll just kind of mention it. And just say, like, again, communication, that's kind of the key when we're feeling all these feelings. How do we keep talking? And so we've created a handout for tips for talking to your children about your illness. And this is another one that you can download. I went through the alphabet and just had some different tips and tricks to be aware of that can be really helpful in like age appropriately addressing your kids and what they need from you in that. I think probably if I was going to theme it up, I would say one of the biggest themes of talking to your kids is remembering that the younger that they are, the more egocentric they are, meaning the more they frame the world and how it's affecting them directly. And so being able to answer their questions in that, like appealing to that egocentric bent is really helpful. So when they're asking like, are you going to die? What they're really interested in is, and it's appropriate for this, is like, what's going to happen to me? And so we want to give them age appropriate facts, but we also want to frame that in comforting them that they're going to be taken care of. That's a really helpful mindset when you're dealing with children, especially, like I said, the younger they are, the more egocentric they are, the more they think that way. Like, what's going to happen to me? So a lot of these tips will imply that understanding for sure.
So good. Thank you, Gina. And you guys definitely check those out in the app. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out to us. But I'd love to hear a little bit from Erin and her personal experience. You received these resources from us when you were served, and I'm curious sort of how your family was impacted by some of these things.
So those first two are great. And I would second what Gina said about just our family has a core value of transparency, and you need to be communicating with your kids and how you're feeling, because then they will feel comfortable. And then also I learned that, mine are 17 and 16, but they felt better when they were given a choice. Like, how much do you want to know? How much do you want to talk about it? And that they're part of the process. But honesty was very important. And then I would say there's an exercise that we did that was most impactful for my family, and it was worry yarn. And they gave us a big thing of yarn, and teenage boys aren't really great about crafts, and and I'm like, just do it. It's gonna be awesome. And so you had to cut your string to name a worry and then how big it was, like to put it in perspective. And so each of us went around and did that, and then had discussion about it. And we talked, and it was really great. But then, and I asked my child if I could share this, but he said in the team group later to one of the leaders, the facilitators, I didn't realize that my mom was worried about the same things I was. And that's just validation. That's bringing your family together. It's unifying. And it just, you can really ease something. I agree with you. It's almost, we call it narcissist in our house, like the world revolves around a teenager. But when you see them and they can see your heart, and you'd be able to put like a name to it and a feeling, and how big it is and how little it is. And then we could ease some of those things that they had, like worries about finances and what's going to happen to them, and things like that. So that exercise was very impactful. I still remember it like it was yesterday. And the other thing was just talking. I think she talked about it as well, like caregivers. Talking with other caregivers was super helpful for me, just because you don't, like what she was saying, you don't want to overwhelm the diagnosed parent with your feelings, but you do have to talk about them. You can't like just be sunshine and rainbows every day. So that was super helpful for me to process that, because sometimes you just can't do that with your girlfriends. They don't know what you're going through, and it was really helpful for me to be able to process some of that.
I love something you just said, Erin, when you were describing the worry yarn, and you said, like, we named them, we cut the string, and then it created a discussion. And I think obviously that is the whole point, is to create a dialogue that maybe is not natural to some families. Maybe some families, even if they do have the core value of transparency, which I love that you have that, they don't even know how to talk about these hard things. Like, you don't just sit down and say, tell me your worries, especially to teenage boys. But like this tool of naming your worry and cutting the yarn, or coloring your heart by giving each emotion a color. These are tools so that it does create a discussion. And it's pretty amazing how it opens up a dialogue that will be a gift and will help your family through something that's difficult. I also love, Erin talked about talking with other caregivers. You guys all at this point should be aware that Inheritance of Hope offers Hope at Home groups every night of the week for all different groups of people. And one of those groups is specifically for caregivers. And it is a sweet community of people. It is led by a very sweet man. And these people meet every week and they talk about some of the things Aaron was just saying. Like, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. Life is hard. You're caring for someone who's sick. You're tired. You're experiencing the emotions of anticipatory grief. And if you're doing it right, they're being felt. All those feelings are being felt. And that is something you need to share with people who get it. And that group is a group of people who get it. So you should check that out on the website or the app that you just downloaded. It's also on there under Hope at Home groups. So I really do love, thank you for sharing that, Aaron, your personal experience with that. This next section, we're gonna jump back over to Erica for a few minutes to talk about hope. And you know, we're all about hope here, guys. Inheritance of Hope. It's not just a logo on our shirts. There is a lot of hope, even in loss and grief. And so I love the way that Erica is going to unpack this for us. So I'm going to share my screen again and let you listen for a couple of minutes.
All right, so we've talked about emotions of grief and different anticipatory grief reactions, but now let's talk about the role of hope. So Coella and Barbosa conducted a study in 2017, and they analyzed 29 prior research studies that had been conducted on anticipatory grief. And the really neat thing that the authors concluded in their study was that hope remains until the end. They found that hope was present throughout the entire end-of-life trajectory, but it does change shape along the way a little bit. You know, think about it. Initially, upon diagnosis, one of the things that the authors found is that the families might hope for a complete recovery. They might hope that the illness is healed and that everything will return back to normal, if you will. And then it might change a little bit as the prognosis changes. Perhaps their hope changes or shifts, and they hope that their loved one can continue to fight the illness, that they continue to remain independent while they're undergoing different treatments or dealing with significant complications from illness. They might hope that they can still have moments of joy, or maybe we can still take that family vacation even though mom is so sick. And by the way, not just the caregivers feel these things, but the people themselves who are diagnosed might feel this way as well, right? I hope I can make it to my son's graduation, or I hope I can make it to the trip that we were planning. I hope I can continue to maintain my independence while I fight this illness. And so it changes shape. So again, starting out sometimes with a hope for recovery. And one of the things the authors identified is that some families reported that even when they realized their loved one was going to die, they thought that death was the most likely outcome, they sometimes sustained words or messages of hope as a means of providing support to their loved one. And so they continue to encourage that hope along the way. So again, even though the prognosis or the disease changes, sometimes the hope remains. And at the end of life, hope shifts a little bit. And you know, I think if you have had a loved one who has gone through this experience, you might be able to identify that our hope might change to hoping that our loved one can be free from pain or free from suffering toward the end of their life. We hope that they are able to have a peaceful death, a death where they're able to be surrounded by family members or friends. We hope that they're able to hear our affirmations of love and of hope, and that they're able to feel that love from us. Caregivers often hope that they're able to provide good and adequate care to their loved one at the end of their life. And so ultimately what the authors concluded is that while it did change, hope is there. And this is consistent with a lot of just the work of people like Dr. George Bonanno and others who have studied resilience. And we know that human beings have a capacity for resilience. And I think that part of that is illustrated here in their capacity for hope, even during really adverse circumstances, and recognizing that hope is not a false belief, and that sometimes it can be interpreted as such by the medical community, right? We might say, oh, well, they're just hoping for healing, but we've told them there's no chance. Well, let's actually get to the root of what they are hoping for, because there may be some other hopes in there as well. And it might be things like going to the beach one more time, or seeing that sunrise, or being free from pain. And so what can we do to help those dreams and help patients with these aspects of their legacy toward the end of their life?
Oh, I love hope. Oh, I really do. Erin, I'm curious how, like Erica shared, how the hope kind of changed through your journey. And obviously you can kind of finish it off. I know that you already shared how important your faith was in your hope, but even in walking out Jeremy's, like, from diagnosis through, I'm sure the hope changed and shifted, like Erica was describing. How did you see that in your Jeremy and in your family?
I would say that hope is just such a powerful thing, and it is not a pie in the sky thing like, well, I have hope. It's a very, it's a tangible thing. It is a choice some days to choose hope or to choose joy in difficult circumstances. But I watched Jeremy do that beautifully. I think what I told you is his face was paralyzed, and then he got to the point where he couldn't walk. And, being a 44-year-old ex-football player, executive, that took a lot of that pride away, right? And then we go back to our faith, and our hope is not in our body and our physical, it is the joy of going to be with our Creator. And so once that kind of, he processed, the anticipatory grief, as I weave that in there, but it really is true. He started to, this is going to sound crazy, but he started to get excited about where he was going, and that he would be healed, and that he would be catching passes and pitching again. And, just, I don't know, I have such joy and excitement about that for him, because he was looking forward to those things. And I think I said it, he didn't really care about the things, but he loved the experiences. And I just think of all the beautiful views he has now, and the, man, I'm sure he's, throwing over 100 his pitches, like miles per hour. I have that joy, and my kids do as well. I'm sure they go through different seasons, but that hope that we have that unifies all four of us, our hearts, is with our Creator. And if we know that we'll see him again, and he won't be seeing out of one eye, and he will be with us and totally restored. And so that's how my children sleep at night, is that they know their Father is with Jesus. So
I love that. Thanks for sharing that. Because we're friends and we've walked a little bit of this journey together, I also know that there was a time towards, like, the end, where he was, deteriorating health-wise. And I wonder if you could speak for a second to, like, the way you felt when there was that time when you're like, it's okay. Like, I hope that you no longer have to suffer. What was that like for you?
Well, Jill, that's a heavy question. I love you, and I will answer it.
Tell me I could.
Man, I was doing so good. Okay, so I would say we had a lot of those conversations, and towards the end, I knew, gosh, I say this all the time, but he got to where he couldn't walk, and the Lord was so good in that he didn't want this hospital bed in our house. And he, big dude, so they had to bring this big, and he was like, I don't want to do this. I don't want my kids to see me that way. And, the beauty of it is the bed was only at our house less than 24 hours. And that's the goodness of God, giving Jeremy his heart's desire. And when we had those conversations, when he finally, because I always gave him the choice, and that's something I want to do for my children, but we had to do that for Jeremy. He needed to die in his own way. I could say, yes, I want you to be here in my house and be around me, but it's ultimately his decision. And I watched him just have those conversations with the kids and his parents, and Jeremy was a twin. So his twin brother was there, and just a beautiful transition when you say it's okay, like you can go be healed. And then, I know we're going to talk about it, but on the other side of that, the legacy video that he left, he affirms everything we talked about. And he made that video, 3 months prior to him passing. And it was so amazing because he was like, I am healed. I am free. Please make memories, take risks, still be transparent, still, all those things. And so I know hospice, it's like dignity through dying. And I really got to see that happen, because it was I can't believe I'm saying that, but it was a beautiful process. And it's one of the greatest weeks of my life. And I know that sounds even so backwards, but it was just gorgeous the way he transitioned.
Yeah, that wasn't one of the questions we had talked about. And so I appreciate you being vulnerable and willing. And the reason I asked is because I know some of the people on this call, I see their names, and I know that what you just shared will be it's going to make me choke up, a tremendous blessing to them. And you guys, Erin and I had talked about this webinar a while ago, and she said, I know that I'm supposed to do this, even though it's hard, and talking about all of this is hard, because I know God doesn't want to waste my pain. And that's the truth of this. Like, as hard as it is that Erin has had to walk this out, that each of you have had to walk this out, there is something beautiful about, by her sharing her heart, her hope and mine and Gina's and Erica's. We want this to bless you, and so you can bless others. We're running out of time, so I'm going to actually move us into this final segment. I love, Erin talked about Jeremy's legacy video. I am so thankful that I got to help him make that. I can think of no better thing to do for my friend than to help her husband make a legacy video. So hopefully all of you have made yours. But this next section, we're going to talk about continuing bonds. And as you're listening to it, if it's tickling something in your soul, I want you to keep in mind that Erica does an entire breakout session on continuing bonds, and it's happening on Sunday at 12:30. It's under the focus track on your schedule. So if you're really interested in what you're about to hear, this is a very short segment. You can tune into Erica's whole breakout session on Sunday. But we're going to just go ahead and play this last little clip from Erica, and then we'll chat about it for a second.
Okay, let's talk about this concept of continuing bonds and how it impacts why we're all here today, and how it's just closely intertwined with the work of Inheritance of Hope. Continuing bonds was what my dissertation research was on. It's something that I am very passionate about, the concept of continuing bonds and of legacy building. So just a quick overview. This could be an entire presentation, so I'm going to be as short as possible on this portion, because I know there's so much more to discuss today. But first, I alluded earlier to Sigmund Freud's grief work theory, where he really initially, even though he did change some of his framework on this, viewed grief as an illness that survivors needed to get over, where we kind of hear some of that language today. But it really went from severing all ties, or emotional separation and relinquishment of our bonds. And he later realized that we can't really separate all bonds. And that was after he experienced some significant personal deaths in his own life, that he realized that relinquishment of those emotional bonds was not possible. And that's where John Bowlby came on the scene with attachment theory as well. And he taught us that attachment is primal and instinctual. He taught us that human beings, our entire lives revolve around the attachments that we form. And in 1980, John Bowlby published a book called The Loss of a Spouse. And in that book, he described widows from some early bereavement studies, and he found that they maintained continuing bonds to their spouses. And so what he realized, and what most theorists realize now, is that it would be unnatural to expect a severance of all bonds or emotional ties following a death. And so again, we know now that even though death severs a physical attachment, our emotional attachment to those we love remains. And here's the thing, we maintain those bonds in beautiful and diverse ways. For some people, it might be after a death visiting a cemetery, and maybe that's very important to them for the first year or 2 years or even 3, but then maybe it changes shape. And maybe now I wear my dad's motorcycle jacket because it reminds me of him and I feel close to him when I'm wearing it. Or maybe whenever I see a ladybug, it reminds me of somebody that I love who has died, and it's a way that I feel a connection to them. Even though they are not in my lives on a daily basis. And so part of the work of legacy building and anticipatory grief counseling really is thinking about starting this continuing bonds process even before the death, because we want to do anything we can to help establish these bonds before the death so that survivors have them after the death as well to help them cope. And so let's discuss some of the possibilities for anticipatory grief interventions before someone dies. Now, we know obviously anticipatory grief counseling is something that's possible, and we might even have to discuss what to expect when a family member is dying. Sometimes kids have a lot of questions about those things. I wrote a short little book to help explain the dying process to young children who were aged about 4 to 7, because I got a lot of questions from parents about how do I explain this to my young child, and that was something that I utilized in anticipatory grief counseling. So there are a lot of different ways to do this, but some of it is going to be providing that psychoeducation and support to families. And then obviously we want to consider things like linking objects, like that motorcycle jacket that I talked about. One thing that I found in practice that happens sometimes is that children, for example, somebody might say, hey, I want you to have this ring that belonged to me. But then they don't actually give that ring to the child, especially. This happens a lot if someone's under the age of 18. They don't give those things to them prior to the death. And so then sometimes after the death, other family members will swoop in and say, oh, no, he wanted me to have this ring. And that can lead children to feeling very disenfranchised in their grief, or not having like a right to the things that they thought they were going to have a right to. And so if we can have those discussions prior to death, when someone has a life-limiting illness, then that can be something beneficial to all of the family members. We also know that we can do things like legacy videos and journals and anticipatory grief retreats. And that even at Inheritance of Hope, some of the families that I've worked with have said to me, we didn't know there was a name for what we were feeling. And just knowing, oh, I'm having symptoms or reactions of anticipatory grief, and these are normal and they are to be expected, and I am not alone. Just knowing that we're not alone sometimes can make a tremendous difference and can actually significantly be a protective buffer and can provide for us in our grief. So I will let my colleagues take it from here with more of that information. But I want to leave you with a quote that's one of my favorite. This quote is by Meister Eckhart, and he said, "Truly it is in the darkness that one finds the light. So when we are in sorrow, then this light is nearest of all to us." Thank you for being with us today. I know this is a hard topic. I know it's difficult to discuss grief and loss, especially when we are all carrying our own feelings of grief and loss amid a pandemic.
So this idea of continuing bonds, I told you it's going to be a great topic on Sunday, but I'm very curious to hear from you, Erin, and I know what some of the things you're going to say, that how is Jeremy still very much a part of your life and the boy's life?
Because we don't stop talking about him. He is, and we did it before, and we worshiped during our trials. And now when we worship, we feel like we're worshiping with him, whether that's at your place of, church or a favorite song. He had a song called that it was his theme song. It was "This Is How I Fight My Battles," and it's basically with praise and thanksgiving. And my children got to watch their father do that. And so on the other side of death, my children are having to do that, but they've seen it modeled for them. So I can listen to that song now with joy right after I took a little break on that one. But that's one of the ways, is that you continue to talk about him and make it normal. And then that helps other people that don't know what to say to you, and they don't know whether they should bring up your spouse or your loved one. It just was so helpful. I had someone tell me that, just keep talking about him. It's healthy for you. It's healthy for your boys. And then people know what to say, because they want to talk about Jeremy or how he impacted them. The other one is the video. If you haven't done your video, please do it. It is the best gift he could ever give us. I've watched it 10 million times, and he didn't want to do it because his face wasn't working properly. And Jill made him do it, and he did it. And I'm so, so happy. And then I also have gifts for my children. I hope they're not listening right now. And then I also have letters for them for when they graduate, which one is graduating in May. And then I also have letters for them when they get married. So he's going to be part of our life forever, and he's constantly on our hearts and in our minds, but it's not all sad. And so I hope that encourages you that he's still very much alive in our house.
I love that, Erin, so much. And some of you might have already heard me share this at a legacy retreat, but I'll tell you that Kristen Milligan, the co-founder of Inheritance of Hope, she passed away in 2012. And I can tell you, she was my best friend, that I still see now, 9 years later, I still see her mothering her kids. I know that sounds crazy. She is no longer with us on this physical earth. But because of the intentionality of videos, letters, gifts, the things like what Erin mentioned, I see the impact that she is making on her children's lives. And it is powerful. That's that continuing bonds thing that Erica will go into more detail on Sunday. But you have an opportunity now, all of us. If you have a diagnosis, certainly there's an extra measure of urgency or a little fire under you. It's a little nudge. But even if you don't have a diagnosis, none of us is guaranteed tomorrow. So let's make the most of today. We are here today. God woke us up and put breath in our lungs. And so let's be intentional with how we choose to live our lives today. And if you are a parent, there are ways that you can put things in place so that you can continue to parent, continue to love your spouse. I know Erin still feels very loved by Jeremy because of these things that he did. And other things that she didn't mention. I'm certainly thinking about your financial security. And Gina had mentioned, especially if you're a single parent and you have a life-limiting illness, figure out a good plan for your kids, because there is nothing worse. And we've seen it with Inheritance of Hope, that you think you're going to make it and maybe you don't. And then we don't really know what's happening with the kids. And that's a very difficult situation. So getting your affairs in order. And I say that it sounds a little bit stiff, but it is a gift that we have to do that today. And we want to come alongside you, and we want to cheer you on. And sometimes we want to twist your arm, like maybe I did with Jeremy. I don't regret it one bit. And I know when I see him in heaven, he'll thank me. But I just feel grateful, Erin, that you were willing to be vulnerable. I know that it's not easy. Gina, I'm always grateful to you, your wisdom and your insight and your sensitivity in all these manners. Erica Sarine, so grateful to her. Please check her out on Sunday. And amazingly, since we're going into our next session, I will give a shameless plug, since we were just talking about practical ways to build your legacy. That is my next session. So if you're interested in learning more about some of those things that we just touched on, you can join me at 4 o'clock, and I will look forward to seeing you there. Thank you guys so much for attending this session, and I hope that the rest of your day is amazing. We'll see you later. Bye.